Before we start the video, I need to do the usual disclaimer when I do Historathon videos. I am not a historian, I am only a reader on the internet who shares what she reads. I am currently learning a lot about the Spanish conquest and all of the adjacent topics because I've been reading a lot about it and I want to share with you what I have learned. But I'm not a historian. Another disclaimer is that English is not my first language and I use a lot of while I'm trying to think of the word that I'm looking for. Usually I edit those out, but this was a hard video to edit, so I didn't edit every ramble and every and I'm sorry for that. A final disclaimer is that as I read more and more, and the more I read about the Spanish conquest, the more I think the Spanish conquest is a misnomer, but that is what I am referring to it in this video and in the title, and that is what I refer to it when I talk about it, because that is the word that we know. Here I want to share with you a description that I read on the Twitter profile of a webcomic called Aztec Empire that I highly recommend. It's a non-fiction webcomic about the conquest. It is super well researched. I highly recommend it. It is in English, but in their Twitter profile it says that it is a webcomic about the Aztec Tlaxcalan Castilian War. I really love that description. I'm still going to refer to it as a conquest in this video because of what I said, but that is a great way to call it and I wanted to share it with you. Hello everyone and welcome back to Mariana Mas Books. My name is Mariana and today I am here with a video that I have been promising in the Historathon Discord for a long time and it's finally here. It is a video about the event that we call the Spanish conquest. But first, for anyone new to my channel, welcome. My name is Mariana and if you didn't know, I have been participating in Historathon since last year. Historathon is a reading event, year-long reading event to read non-fiction history. Last year I participated as a co-host, but this year I wanted to not participate as a co-host because I wanted to break the rules in terms of the time periods. I have been reading for different time periods of history that don't necessarily correspond to the quarters that are assigned for Historathon. And one of those topics is precisely the topic of today's video. I wanted to make a video about it because quarter 3 of Historathon is going to start in July and it covers from 1500 to 1820. So I wanted to do this video in case anyone is interested in reading about the Spanish conquest for quarter 3. Today I am going to give you a general overview and then I'm going to make a video about book recommendations that I will upload next week. Again, if you're new here, I'm from Mexico, which is why I'm reading mostly Mexican history for Historathon. So if you're here from Mexican historical fiction, today it's Mexican historical non-fiction. So why do I want to make this video? Well, as I said, I have been reading a lot about Mexican history and the Spanish conquest, and I wanted to be able to recommend a book in English for my Historathon friends and for anyone who is interested. What I was doing was I was reading a bunch of books trying to find the perfect book to recommend. I was trying to find the book that I wanted to recommend to people. But surprise, surprise, there is no such thing as a perfect book. And every book that I read had things that made me hesitant to recommend it. And so I kept reading and I kept reading. trying to find the book. And then I realized that I was never going to find the perfect book. So instead, what I thought was that I'm going to do a video where I'm going to summarize what we know was the Spanish conquest, just really briefly give you an overview, so that you know the basic history, the basic timeline, so to speak, and you can pick up any book and understand the basic context, while also giving you some important considerations that you have to take into account no matter what book you are reading. So that way I can make my recommendations video and I can give you a myriad of options and I can tell you the pros and cons of each book, and you can choose whatever book you want. But my hope is that with this video it will provide you enough context and explanation and enough idea of the things that you have to consider while reading. So what is the event that is known as the Spanish conquest? Usually we are referring to a 3-year period, which is one of the things that the authors that I like disagree with, but I'm not going to go there yet. Usually we are referring to the 3-year period between 1519, which is the year when the Spanish fleet arrived in the coast of what is now Mexico, led by Hernán Cortés, and 1521, which is the year when Tenochtitlan, which was, let's say, the capital of the Aztecs, fell. Because the group of Spanish that came with Cortés was very small, it was only a few hundred men and women, and because the people here had big cities, big towns with big armies and very qualified armies with thousands of soldiers, and because usually the conquest is only considered between these 3 years, that has led to centuries of people saying that a small group of Spanish men managed to defeat a very big civilization, military civilization, in only 3 years. And so they are regarded as these heroes that managed an impossible feat. And usually that is the question that you see asked. How could a group of men so small defeat in 3 years an entire empire? And as to that, I want to share with you a quote by Matthew Restall from his book When Montezuma Met Cortés, that I think really gives food for thought, and it's good to keep the quote in mind while reading about the conquest. Gradually, it dawned on me that the wrong questions were being asked, or they were being asked in the wrong way. Not by students or email correspondents, but by scholars and writers, by me. The challenge must be, therefore, to resist asking, let alone answering, why Montezuma and the Mexican people were so quickly conquered by the Spanish. Instead, let us first enter the notion that they were not quickly conquered. Then let us ask why that question has been phrased in that way. I think that is a great way to view history in general, not just the conquest, just challenging the questions that are normally asked. And in this specific case, I think the challenging the question, how could a small group of Spanish men, makes you consider all of the circumstances that you don't normally consider, because when you're starting with that question, you are already starting with a presupposition. And with that, I think we can continue. So it was this 3 year period of war between the Castilians and their allies, mostly their allies. This is one important note. The Castilian or Spanish army was very small, and so in its majority, it was an army of Mesoamerican allies. So the war between them and the Aztec army and their allies. An important thing to know is that in that 3 year period, there wasn't actually a lot of war. It was mostly until the end that the actual war started. There had been some battles before then, but they were isolated battles, mostly fought from the Spanish Castilian troops along the way to Tenochtitlan with the people that they found along the way, and as they were gaining allies. But like the war in itself for the Aztecs versus the Tlaxcaltecs and Castilians, that lasted a very short time comparatively with the 3 year period. As I said, this 3 year period is not all there was. There is a long history, long politics before then, and there was a long period after 1521 where Spain was still, or Castile was still struggling to maintain power, where there were still a lot of independent civilizations. It wasn't like immediate that after the Aztecs fell, then the Spanish were ruling over Mesoamerica. But yeah, so usually in history we refer, if you hear of the Spanish conquest, most likely people are thinking of the 3 year period. Most books that you will read will refer to that 3 year period, although the newest books do talk about more than 3 years. If there is a topic that you would like to know more about, then do let me know in the comments. Quick note of context from before 1519. Before the Spanish arrived to the what is now Mexican territory, there was already a Spanish colony in the Antille Islands, in Cuba and the Antilles. And there had already been 2 previous expeditions that had set from Cuba to explore Mexico, which was believed to be an island. After Columbus was trying to find the Indies, people were still trying to find it. And so the Spanish believed that Yucatán, which is the peninsula in Mexico, they believed that that was an island, and that if they passed through that island, they could then reach the Indies. So there were already 2 expeditions that had been that had arrived to the coasts of Mexican territory. This is important to know because when the eventual 1519 bigger expedition came to stay, the people here already knew about the Spanish. The Spanish were not a complete surprise, as it is commonly known. Of course, it was a surprise what eventually happened, and people here didn't know that they were going to come, but when they eventually came, they already knew about them. So in 1519, the troop led by Hernan Cortés arrives at the coast of Yucatan, or what is now Yucatan. They actually do arrive at an island, but I'm not going to go into detail. They arrive at that area in what is now Mexican territory, which was Maya territory. Now, Maya were not the Maya were not an empire. It wasn't like the Maya Empire. That is another common misconception. So, because there had already been 2 previous expeditions, when Cortés arrived, he already had an idea of what he was going to find. The Spanish already had an idea of what they were going to find. And the Maya already had an idea about the Spanish from the 2 previous expeditions. The main difference would be that the 2 previous expeditions, they didn't come with the idea to fight, whereas Cortés did bring horses, did bring more weapons, cannons, and he did have the idea to stay and conquer. There is an interesting background to the story of how Cortés eventually became the leader of the expedition, because he actually didn't have any military experience. So there is a super interesting and super fun story about how he managed to get away with it, and he managed to escape the governor of Cuba because he actually came without permission. I'm not going to go into detail into that, but there is a fun story about how that happened that will maybe get its own video, I don't know. So when they eventually arrived in Maya territory, they already had 2 translators. This is another important note that you always have to keep in mind when you are reading conquest history. The Spanish didn't speak the language of the people here. There were different languages. There was Maya and different versions of Maya. There was Totonaca, there was Nahuatl. There were many different languages, and the Spanish didn't speak any of them. That is very important, because that when you keep that in mind, then you discern more deeply that a lot of the scenes in which you are told that the Spanish made certain decisions or said certain things or made certain negotiations, it wasn't actually them, and they had way less agency than we are led to believe. Now, when they arrived to the coast, they already had 2 translators, because from the previous expeditions and from the experience the Spanish already had in the Antilles, they knew the importance of translators, and so when the expeditions came, they actually took 2 men by force, obviously, to become their translators. So when Cortés came, he brought with him the 2 men that they had previously stolen from Maya territory to work as translators. There were 2 Spanish men living with the Maya at the time who had been enslaved along with many other Spanish men. So from previous expeditions, there was a group of Spanish men that had been taken captive by the Maya. By the time Cortés arrived, only 2 survived, only 2 were left. One of them, Jerónimo de Aguilar, he was a priest, and he was living as a slave with the Maya. And the other one, Gonzalo Guerrero, he had married a Maya woman, he had a family, he had sons, and he was a military commander for the Maya. So the first thing that Cortés does when he arrives is that he sends a letter to the Spanish men that were with the Maya in order to recruit them. He sends them a letter to say, listen, we need translators, we are here, we come to save you, please come back to us and help translate. And from the 2 men, Jerónimo de Aguilar does come back, but Gonzalo Guerrero, because he was already a military leader, he already was married, he had sons, He had already tattoos. He was already living as a Maya. He chose not to come back, and legend has it that he later fought against the Spanish with the Maya. So so that is important because Jerónimo de Aguilar started working as translator in from Maya to Castilian. Within the Maya territory, there are several battles. We do have first-hand account of those battles by Spanish conquistadors, where you can see the fear that they had and the strength with which the Maya fought. And those are super interesting accounts because they describe the sounds, the feelings, you really feel in those early battles. The one I'm going to talk about is the battle in Centla. I'm not going to talk about the battle in itself, but I am going to mention that one because after that one, the Spanish are gifted with a group of women, or rather girls, who were slaves of the Maya. And in that group of girls, there was Malintzin, who eventually became the official translator for the expedition. People love to spin a love story between Cortés and Malintzin. I think everything was done by force. I'm not going on that tangent. So Malintzin eventually becomes the official translator. She eventually even has a son with Cortés. She is a super important figure in the history of the conquest. So this is where she makes her appearance. We don't know a lot about her life. We don't even know what her name was, but when she's gifted to the Spanish, she was already bilingual, and she is baptized as Marina. So from Marina, then you get Malina, because in Nahuatl you don't have the R sound, and from Malina she starts being called Malintzin, because Tzin is an honorific and she is very important and very respected. And from Malintzin, the Castilians start calling her Malinche, and so you can know her as, or you can read about her as Marina, as Doña Marina, as Malintzin, as Malinche, as even Malinali, who a lot of people thought was her original name, but again, we don't know what her original name was. She becomes so important that the people in Mesoamerica call Cortés Malinche. They call him Captain Malinche because he was always with Malintzin, because she translated for him. There was a point where Jerónimo de Aguilar was no longer needed, and she became the official translator, and every negotiation, everything that happened, everything went through Malintzin. There is a very interesting drawing made by historian Federico Navarrete, where he explains the chain of translation that is just really amazing to consider. He also has this quote where he says that the war was not won in battle but in translation. This is again a very important consideration, and I did stop here more than I wanted to, just because it is very important to understand that nothing that was said or negotiated was done directly by the Spanish, that there was big cultural differences, big linguistic differences that had a big part in everything that happened. A fun fact I can give you that is more infuriating than fun, but in his letters that he writes, Cortés only mentions Malintzin once. He doesn't refer to her by name. He refers to her as his tongue. I don't know if that would be the translation in English, but you know, the person who speaks. And the only point where he mentions her is to blame her for a massacre that the Spanish committed, and that's literally the only time he mentions her. But in other Spanish accounts, in other indigenous accounts, in codexes everywhere, she is super present. So she is a very important figure. Now that I've stopped here so long, we can move on. So after Maya territory, they eventually make their way towards Totonac territory, and they arrive to what is now Veracruz, and that is where they found the Villa Rica de la Veracruz, and they make that their like base camp kind of for some time. I'm oversimplifying a lot of things, obviously, because I just want to give you the summary. So when they arrive to Totonac territory, they are received with welcome, very differently than the Maya, because the Maya were more antagonistic towards the Spanish, and they did engage more in battle with them. The Totonacs welcomed them, and that is because in the Totonac area, the central area, the Mexica were the ruling empire. I'm going to explain something about that. And so when the Spanish arrive, many local civilizations that were enemy to the Mexica, to the Aztecs, eventually become the allies of the Spanish in order to defeat the Mexica, the Aztecs. Now, an important thing to note is that the Aztecs were not an empire as we now understand an empire to be. So they did engage in battle, and they did conquer over different civilizations, and a lot of civilizations were their vassals, to use a European term. But what that meant was not in the sense of like the Roman Empire, where if the Romans conquered a territory, then that territory became part of the Roman Empire, and they were Romans, and they were ruled by the Romans. It wasn't like that. So the Aztecs won over a territory. What that meant was that this territory now had to pay tribute, like a tax, and they would have to help the Aztec or the Mexica in military. So provide military, they would become allies in military need, in need of war. But they still remained, if the Aztecs won over the Totonacs were still the Totonacs. They still had their rulers, their culture, their religion. But they had to pay tribute, tax, and they had to come to the aid of the Aztecs in military need, provide that, right? So it wasn't an empire in the European sense. So after the Totonacs received the Spanish, they accompany them towards Tlaxcala. The Spanish, they want to reach Tenochtitlan because they know that is where the Lord, the big Lord, the Emperor, as they understand it, is. And so that is where they want to go. In order to get there, they are advised by their allies, by their local allies. As I said previously, the Spanish had way less agency than we are led to believe. These are people arriving to a territory that they don't know culturally, they don't know linguistically, and they don't know geographically, and they don't know politically. So clearly they relied a lot on the help of the local allies. And here I'm going to make a quick note, just because I think this is my personal interpretation, not something I read. This is like what I have gathered from the books that I have read. My personal interpretation of Cortés, who is thought to be this super smart strategic leader. Even an author like Hugh, who is a fan of Cortés, will tell you that Cortés didn't have military experience. So for me, his strategicness and his smartness lies on the fact that he knew when to step back, and he knew how to listen to the experts. That's my personal interpretation. Like, he had a lot of experts. He had translators, he had generals, local military generals. He had people who knew, so he relied on the expertise of the people around him. And there are leaders who are not willing to do that. I think Cortés was willing to do that because he realized how important that was. And also, of course, marketing. Because he knew when to step back. He knew to let experts make decisions or counsel him. But then he also knew how to sell himself. And the letters that he wrote to the emperor were like the biggest marketing campaign of history. So that is what I think personally about Cortés. That's the conclusion I have come to from all that I have read. So the Totonacs lead them to Tlaxcala, which was another civilization that were enemies of the Aztecs, and the Tlaxcalans at first receive them with violence. They actually have to fight against the Tlaxcalans. There was a division within Tlaxcala because their younger generals wanted to fight the Spanish, and the older generals, they wanted to ally with the Spanish in order to go against the Aztecs, the Mexica. Eventually, the older men win over the younger men, and they become allies. Because the Spanish had a lot of local allies, that has led many people to make certain claims, and a lot of people consider either the Tlaxcalans or even Malintzin, the translator, as traitors, because they were allying or aiding the Spanish. And so the discourse usually goes, how could they betray their own people, and therefore are considered traitors. But in the 16th century, when the Spanish came, there was no such thing as a Mesoamerican identity. There was no such thing as Mesoamerica. There were different cultures, different civilizations, different cities, different identities, separate identities, separate civilizations within the region. But putting all of them together as one team is a modern notion that is done in retrospect. At the time, the Tlaxcalans were not being traitors to their people. They did not have a concept of Mesoamerica, and they did not have a concept of Europe. They did not act thinking, I am betraying the Mesoamericans to aid the Europeans. They were acting in benefit of their people, and their people were the Tlaxcalans. And same goes for every other civilization, every other ally. People were defending their people, because Mesoamerica is a concept created after colonization. I think most historians nowadays do acknowledge that most of the army was made up of locals, and that they were the reason why the war was won. There used to be this idea that it was the horses and the artillery. Nowadays, I think most people agree that it was the local army that allows the Spanish to win. But even people who acknowledge that, the way that they usually talk about it is, how the poor Tlaxcaltecs or the poor Indians, depending on the level of condescension that you use on the language. So they say, oh, the poor locals, the poor natives were taken advantage of, and they didn't know that they were allying with these big bad men who came to conquer, right? Like that's the usual discourse. I think that they were both parties were taking advantage of the other, and neither knew that they were being taken advantage of. So the Spanish wanted to take advantage of the locals to win over the territory, and the Tlaxcaltecs wanted to take advantage of the Spanish for the same reason, to win over the territory. And it's just like, the turn of events happens in such a way that eventually the Spanish end up conquering, and I do think that that is because eventually more ships come from Spain. There were already colonies in other places. Once the expedition starts being successful, then the emperor in Spain starts to take notice. So that's why eventually, the Spanish do end up ruling. But at the moment, both parties, both sides, were taking advantage of the other in order to win over the territory. So after the Tlaxcaltecs ally to the Spanish, they again move along towards Tenochtitlan. By that point, there also was a group of or a group of envoys from Tenochtitlan, from Moctezuma. So there was this thing where Cortés, through Malintzin, is being counseled in contradictory opinions. The Mexica tell him one thing, the Tlaxcaltec tell him another thing. If you read the Spanish accounts, there was a lot of fear. They were very afraid. They were in foreign territory surrounded by an enemy army that they didn't know, with a language they didn't understand, and so there was a lot of confusion as to what to do and all that. There is a very interesting book specifically about the role that Malintzin played and how she potentially had a super big part in like everything that happened. But the Tlaxcaltecs counseled the Spanish for their advantage. So one of the things that ends up happening, for instance, is that when they arrived to Cholula, which was a very important city and sacred center, I don't know how to say, the Tlaxcaltecs were enemies of that territory, and so there's a whole chain of events that happened that eventually lead to the Spanish killing all of the civilians in Cholula. There's a big massacre in Cholula that even the Spanish condemn, which is why Cortés blames it on Malintzin, on the translator, right? I think that's like the only decision he doesn't take responsibility for, and he doesn't make out to be as his decision, or rather, he says he gave the order, but because he was told that there was a conspiracy. So there is this big massacre. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm just trying to get through this. So after Cholula, they keep walking, they eventually make it to Tenochtitlan. When they arrive, they are super amazed. If you read the descriptions of Tenochtitlan by the Spanish, it is honestly, it's one of those things where you could cry that you don't have a time machine and travel to Tenochtitlan because it's so beautiful. They arrive and they are amazed because it is a floating city on a lake, super clean, big constructions, big buildings, big palaces. One interesting fact about the conquistadors is that, as Hugh Thomas puts it in his book, they were the first generation of readers. Of readers. They were avid readers of chivalric literature, and so they literally felt like they were the protagonists in one of their stories. And in one of the descriptions of Tenochtitlan, they compare it to the fantastical places of the stories that they read. They actually believe that they are going to find the creatures from the stories, the characters from the stories. So they arrive in November, and eventually the Cortés does meet Moctezuma. That meeting is one of my biggest historical obsessions, and we don't know a lot about the meeting and about what happened after the meeting, but that happened on November 8th. That is when Cortés and Moctezuma, who was the emperor of the Aztecs, the Tlatoani. And actually, I think that this meeting is a good place to stop and make this video a part 1, and then I'm going to make a part 2. I'm tired and I'm hungry and I've been speaking for a long time, and I have just arrived at Tenochtitlan. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to make a part 2 in the same fashion of this video, like similar to this video, similar structure. I think maybe I will do the book recommendations video, just because people have asked me to do that one so they have time to get the books before the quarter starts. So I think after this video I'm going to make the book recommendations video. I'm going to leave you hanging, and then I'm going to do part 2 of this video. But I hope this was interesting. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was somewhat structured. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, if there are things that you would like to hear about more in detail, certain moments, certain things that events that I talked about. Any questions, whatever, leave it in the comments down below. And with that, I'm going to leave you guys. I will see you soon with another bookish video. And in the meantime, I wish you happy reading.